finding here.
Great. Then I'll start and I'll say good morning and thank you everybody for being here. You're taking the time. Yeah, I want to say I hope you enjoyed the book, but it's not really necessarily the kind of book that you're going to enjoy. But if you're like me, you're going to learn an awful lot from it. I certainly uncovered a whole lot of things that I didn't realize or didn't know. And my hope here had been really to talk about the book and get everybody's perspective on it as opposed to just listening to me. You know, I'm not a historian, I'm a journalist by training. And one of the things that struck me about the book is that it's so well reported and it is so even handed. She doesn't just tell the Jewish side. It doesn't just talk about Israel. She talks about everybody and tries to give you a look at how things are being impacted on everybody who's involved, mostly over there, but also I think she tries to talk about the impact of the global Jewish community. And has everybody had a chance to at least read the 5 chapters that I had laid out? Just so I can know what to say. The reason I put those chapters is 2 of those chapters give you a lot of detail on what happened in 1929 and then also what happened in 2023. Certainly more than 70 years, I guess, well more than 70 years that separated almost 100. And the question that kept going through my mind and that I wanted to kick off with is, have things changed? If you compare the events of 1929 to the events of 2023, are they, besides the violence, but are they common? Are they the same thing, just variations on the theme, or is there some change that was evident in the interim that you could see in the different events? I'm gonna throw it out, start with that. And hope somebody will say something.
Rephrase that question. Yeah, what? Give me that question again.
Well, we saw that there's a massacre in 1929 and there was a massacre in 2023. What was common between them? I mean, besides the violence, and October 7th was certainly bloodier than Hebron in 1929, but still they're both considered watersheds. And when I was reading the accounts of them, I was trying to think about, well, what's different here? What is there a difference between what happened in 2023 and in 1929, or is it just another chapter of the same thing?
Let me comment. I read the entire book. I read first the 5 chapters, and then I read the whole thing because I really wanted to get them. And I think there's a lot lost if you don't read the whole thing. But what's common is that the 2 tragedies are really the same in that they are built on baked-in ideologies. And I'm now reading a book where a neuroscientist has been carefully studying the nature of ideologies. And what we see are those who are true believers that this is, a message from God, this is what I must do. And they overtake those who don't have the ideology. So you really have 2 camps. You have those who say the Haradim, the crazies, they want to fight and they want to draw on everybody. The others say, leave me alone. So you really have the issues of one group that are believers feeling that they have the backing of God.
How do you think what happened in Gaza immediately after sort of fits into that? Because there you had cheering going on in the streets of Gaza when they were bringing the hostages in and all of that kind of thing. So it seems like it at least involved a greater number of people than even the popularity of Hebron in 1929. was certainly something, but Gaza was orders of magnitude worse.
What struck me more than anything else, I think, was the complete futility of any hope for peace. Like, just so depressing. Like, I was struck by something she said, I'm not even sure which chapter this was, page 244, that she talks about how every attack has the absolute opposite effect, that every attack by the Palestinians causes a stronger response from the Israelis and moves the Israeli public further to the right, making the possibilities for peace even further in the future, and that this has gone on and on and on. And I had never seen laid out before in the same way, one time after another, every single peace proposal, every single offer of a two-state solution that was rejected over and over again, including the one by Ehud Barak, which was everything and more that they ever could have asked for, except for the entire removal of the Jewish population from Israel. Zero desire for a two-state solution. And I don't see, like, I'm now just so depressed. Thank you very much for recommending the book, Abraham, because now I'm just so depressed.
Yeah. I think if you trace the pronouncements and the religious excitement by the Grand Mufti
That's right.
and his protege Yasser Arafat, you see that it is a direct linking of saying we will use whatever we need to overcome and to prevail and have the whole pie.
Absolutely, and that hasn't changed.
How did personalities figure into this? I mean, we're
Oh, Andre wants to say something.
oh, I'm sorry, Andre.
That's okay. I just wanted to make a little intro here, sort of give my point of view. I had a unique experience, 2008, of going with the group. That was the reason I understood. That's the first encounter with the shul was through this trip we took which Larry Snyder organized, interfaith trip with Rabbi Sandy, and we were there in 2008, and I had a unique experience, and I can just say the one day what it was like, among many days. But one day we started off in Jerusalem, and we had an appointment to go to Yad Vashem and get a tour. Okay, we had Muslim members with us from North Philly, Black Muslim imams, and a whole combination of different religions and groups. From that spot in Yad Vashem, we went to lunch in Bethlehem, and I have video. I just reviewed it today. We had lunch at a peace initiative place in Bethlehem, and with a city councilman from Bethlehem who was a Hamas member. So there's footage of me sitting eating lunch with this Hamas member, and then we went from that locale an hour later to Hebron, right next to the Abraham tomb, and met with David Wilder, was the head of the settler movement, from Kehilat Arbar and the whole 9 yards. And then from that place, we went to the governor's office in Hebron of the Palestinian Authority, and we divided into different groups who would stay overnight. I, at that time, was a member of a Quaker meeting, and under those auspices, not as being a Jew, but as being a Quaker, I could stay in the town of Hebron overnight with an imam from North Philly and a translator. The house I stayed at was a man whose family were one of the founders of Hamas. So this is a unique experience, and a lot of things ensued from that. But the thing I would want to meet, the meeting with the Hamas member for lunch, he was completely clear. Oh, you're Jews, you can visit Israel once in a while. You can come visit, but you can't live here. This was in 2008, when we were one of the closest moments to getting an agreement. Ulmer was still in, And so that was a unique experience with that thing. And with this, he was kind of like hardcore military wing kind of Hamas guy. But it's interesting, he was a council member in Hebron. He was the governing of Hebron. It's much more ambiguous. In other words, Israelis didn't arrest him. He was part of the government of Bethlehem. And then when we went to Hebron, and I stayed with that gentleman, he was really like the kind of soft wing Hamas guy. The crazy thing about this thing is that, yes, I see very big differences from that time of 29 to even when I went there. First of all, there was a completely different power situation going on. And Hamas is a bit different than the original. In 29, that was really the beginnings of the whole idea of a Palestinian movement. There was an invention of that period. You can have arguments about this, who's a Palestinian, who's not, but it really was created, only after the First World War, the whole idea of Palestinian people. But by this time, in like 2008, Hamas is very in charge. And the guy who I stayed with in Hebron said, if there's an election tonight, Hamas would win in Hebron. And you're dealing, it seemed, I went to that experience of going 2008, I don't want to take too much time, with a very peacenik point of view, very much adamant. I mean, I thought the Israeli government was completely wrong. Over the period of time, and since that time, I've completely changed my point of view. And I've realized there's a lot of performance on all sides. There's a lot of performative things going on. And there's a lot of people on the Palestinian side who will say, in the peace community, I really feel this, will say what we want to hear from them. And not necessarily mean it.
What do other people think? I mean, do you perceive that that's true not only over there, but when you listen to the discussions that happen, say, over here, like on the college campuses? Are people saying what they're hearing, or are people saying what they're feeling? How much of this is just, plain old anti-Semitism that's been around for centuries? Thoughts?
Part of the problem, I think, is that Israel has consistently, for decades, sucked at their own public relations. So the view on college campuses of Israel's being white colonialist occupiers is prevalent. People don't know the history. Israel doesn't talk about it. Israel was not at all open about the atrocities of October 7th as a way of protecting the dignity of the dead. But as a result of that, unless you went looking specifically to know what happened to the women at the Nova Festival, to the people at Kibbutz Be'eri, most people don't know. So the Palestinian narrative is the one that carries the day for people who don't go digging otherwise, because it's the narrative that's out there. It's the one they promulgate. It's the one that falls into the news feeds. So I think, but it's a double-edged thing, because as soon as Israel starts talking about our narrative, then, oh, we're just always the victim. Like, there's no winning.
Others?
Well,
Please, Scott.
Yeah, I would just say with regard to the college campus issue that, well, two things. One is that the narrative that has dominated the press, I think part of that is, though, that our own press, I think at least, were slanted against Israel and against, like, they had an opportunity after the initial event on October 7th. It all quieted down as if nothing happened, and the dominant narrative was what was going on in Gaza, which was obviously tragic, but it didn't diminish what happened, the initial cause, which was obviously this horrible massacre, and the fact that it wasn't the publicity around it, the press really didn't, as far as I'm concerned, do a very good job. So I wouldn't necessarily blame that just on Israel. As far as the students are concerned that were at these rallies, you mentioned, that I just think that they were following these, 3-word, tidbits of information that really was just, wasn't, they didn't know anything about the history. Like, I think to myself, my God, if they read anything about the history of the establishment of Israel and what happened, the Holocaust and everything before that, they would understand where they're coming from. But they didn't do any of that. They just followed these crazy headlines. So I think some of that responsibility lies with the students themselves in the fact that they were not, they were just uneducated.
Well, I think,
putting it bluntly.
so I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt on the very end there. So I'm Rita, I'm a newish member to the congregation. My daughter, Rachel, just graduated from college last year. And so she was on campus, after all that, and 2 of her best friends were Israeli. Who actually lost friends at the music festival. And, it was so interesting to be the parent, right then, and she was just a Franklin and Marshall, so she was really close. I could actually go see her, as soon as I wanted to, like right after, because I wanted to, scared. And the scariest thing for her and for her cousin Maeve, who was actually at Scripps, which is a women's college in California, was just the faculty response was so bad. So you say the kids aren't educated, it's the grown-ups, like they were already, kind of, BDS everything all the time. And then, there was literally nowhere, there was nobody, saying, hey, calm down, let's look at what led to this. Hillel tried, and then they would have, speakers, some other group would set up and bring in, an anti-Jewish side and say, oh, we don't want to listen to you. Her cousin at Scripps actually transferred out. She was not the only, there are not a ton of Jews there, but her Maeve's father is actually Israeli also. So she was the only Israeli Jew at Scripps, and she the professors would cancel class so people could go protest, so like there were no grown-ups leading any information about, hey, this is what's going on. So yeah, definitely students should learn more. But my daughter was pretty well educated. She did a program, a Kids for Peace program. She actually worked with Stand With Us for a year, which nobody liked, but she did it anyway. And she couldn't combat all of it. And she was a pretty well educated, voice. And her Israeli friends, everybody was just crazy. One of her friends' dads was a professor at Franklin and Marshall also. And he said the faculty was so horrible. So I think, we need to remember that these kids are only 18, 19, 20, 21. Of course they're dumb, but it's really the grown-ups that need to read that book. And I think maybe it would be, and I agree, it was a really even-handed book. But what struck me, and I don't know if that's, did anybody who wasn't Jewish give a blurb for it? Like when you talked about, oh, this is a great even-handed book. Is it though? What if we just think it is, but really it's not? Like that's, my concern. So anyway, sorry to babble.
I was also interested to see who published it. And it's a small publisher, like I'm sure nobody else wanted to touch it, I guess a question I had, can I?
Please.
What was one thing that you learned in the book that you didn't know?
That there'd been a massacre in 1929.
Yeah.
I didn't see the through line. I knew about I have known always about isolated events, but I never saw the through line. I never saw how it connected every dot along the way from the massacre in 1929 to the continued references to Al-Aqsa, just the entire through line that says that these are not isolated events. These are events that have built on each other with a, like I have often perceived the Palestinian population as beleaguered, as just being the tools of other Arab countries who have never really cared about their fate, but have used them as a way of punishing Israel or getting, whatever it is they want on the international stage. But I saw more clearly Palestinian agency in this. Yes, there are the cries from the Mufti and, go out and kill Jews. But I also see, excuse me, an educational system that doesn't teach a combined history in the way that Israeli schools teach, obviously a bias, but at least talk about the Arabs who saved Jews in 29. So now I see more of a through line of a more targeted effort with a long-term goal.
I want to add to that, that it is the education. I didn't really want to believe that UNRWA and the UN could be complicit. When you think about their education system, the children are taught to hate. They are taught that, given a different map. This goes on and on and on. And I really believe that, this deception of continuing the hate, going through the delivery of aid and support, that they were really conspiring to continue that hate projection.
One of the things that strikes me is that, the UN, which played such a role in the formation of Israel, the creation of Israel, also seems to be incredibly anti-Semitic and incredibly anti-Israel in almost everything they do, not just UNRWA. But I read that last year there were 16 resolutions floated in the United Nations condemning Israel for something. There were 6 regarding the entire rest of the world.
Mhm.
So, there's a real lopsided dynamic there, and I can never quite square those. Why does the UN come down with such anti-Semitism, but they're also the organization that pushed through the creation of Israel?
Well, they changed a lot from that time of 48, the creation of Israel, the UN. It's a completely different thing now. I think that accounts for that. The other point I thought of just now to make is when you spend time on the West Bank, which I had the opportunity to do, everything I heard about before, when you hear like refugee camp, okay, you have this picture, like a camp, which is in a permanent place. Well, we went to this refugee camp, Al Arub, and while we were there, there was a disturbance, and these kids started to run around throwing stones at the soldiers, and Israeli soldiers came in with rubber bullets and stun grenades, and there was this whole thing that happens all the time. Okay, but the camp itself is not a camp. It's like a small. It's very crowded, but they're stone buildings. There's this huge playground, modern playground. There's these facilities that were donated from like the Deutsche Bank, this huge building and things. And so it's not, a destitute place at all. It's fenced in and they're allowed to go out and not go out. And there's all this odd situation where all the women work and teaching in different villages around and the men stay home. And they hardly do anything. Men go and get educations in Europe that are sponsored by European countries, but they come back. And this whole thing you're bringing up about the UN and UNRWA is big. They foster this kind of dependency where they can stay in this place. They don't have to earn a living. They're surviving. From all appearances, I mean, it's not like a slum at all, you know? The same thing if you go to Ramallah, if you go to these in Hebron, the rest of Hebron, these are not slum places. Ramallah looks like, you know, it looks like, you know, Florida or something. There's good roads are well, and there's all, it's, you see something different than you hear. And when these students are in classes in America and taught by these teachers, they don't see this. They don't perceive this at all. They don't perceive this whole situation. Hebron, when we were going to go to Hebron, they said, well, you can't wear, you know, any Jew can't wear a yarmulke. But even worse than that, if they find out you're gay in any way, that you're dead. You're goodbye. I mean, it's like those are realities, you know. And the reality is that when they're in these college campuses and these guys are teaching, first of all, you're talking about a system. I can't get around it, but it's like it's a hyper left thing. Really, it is. These guys have this point of view, which is very. I mean, they read from a different textbook, a different history, even American history. You know, Howard Zinn's history, that kind of stuff. You know,
Great Howard Zinn story. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I was at BU when Howard Zinn was there, and you know, he and some of his cohorts would basically say, "I'm going to be speaking at this strike event, and you will be quizzed." And these people all taught survey courses with 500 kids in them, so of course there'd be a couple of thousand people showing up, you know, at this strike. On the other hand, I could argue that, you know, the right-wing people are just as good as that, even if there's not as many of them. But I do want to sort of come back to this dynamic about the Palestinians. You know, the Palestinians are the only people in the world who are considered refugees 2 generations after what they supposedly fled from. That you can be, was born in 1960, and I would be considered a refugee. If you followed the UN's logic, I should be able to go back to Latvia and find out where my grandparents lived and reclaim that land. All this, you know, century and a half later.
One of the things that that came up on the Amazon list after I bought this one was one, just to speak to your point, that says UNRWA really should be disbanded, that we are doing the Palestinians no service, and we should finally just tell the original 700,000 plus all of their descendants that there will be no return. There will be no return. So now just let's figure out where you people need to go and settle and gain full citizenship and full access to employment. And I don't see that happening either. Like, I think we're just stuck.
It's also interesting, it's also interesting that, you know, for so long, the Arab countries have fought this proxy war using the Palestinians, not just against Israel, but for their own population, so their own population doesn't rebel against them. So it's been very convenient. And so it's also interesting to see what's happening now as a result of everything that's happened after October 7th. Are there dynamics changing in the Arab world that will result in less money flowing into Hamas and Palestine because they're all tending their own wounds? We haven't really talked about that, and it's interesting. I don't know.
Anyone have a thought to go with that?
Yeah.
It's been very risky for the surrounding Arab nations to let people, and they really don't allow them to really settle. There have been uprisings or let's say Muslim Brotherhood, assassinations, all kinds of other things that that really makes it very difficult for them because they really aren't welcomed and incorporated. There's no desire for them for other nations to do that. They've had bad experiences.
You have the problem, which is the inevitable problem, that seems to me with the supposed occupied territories. I can't stand that term actually, but the occupied territories of the West Bank, it can't be incorporated in Israel, and Israel continued to be a democratic country because of the voting. You know, there are too many of them, and it'll cease to be a Jewish state. You know, Israel eventually. So we're forced into this position where no matter what happens, it seems to me, and I don't think it's going to be necessarily a good work out perfectly, but you're going to have some semblance of a Palestinian entity take shape in some form, you know, with parts of Gaza, parts of the West Bank, tunnels between them. They're good at, you know, everybody's making tunnels, they know how to make tunnels. But, and I don't probably, it seems to me from the history of the Arab countries and their governance, I'm not very optimistic about how that would be governed properly. But at least there are a lot of people that I follow in Israel who want, at least then we can have Israel be with people who want to be in Israel, you know, want to be part of the country.
But we, you know, we sort of forget that the reason they're called the occupied territories is because that these were all pieces of land that the Israelis captured in 1967, and the Arabs didn't want to discuss taking back. So Israel's kind of been saddled with them. And I found, I don't remember actually if it was in the book or somewhere else that I read that when Israel gave back the Sinai to Egypt, they also intended to give back Gaza.
Yes,
the Egyptians didn't want
they refused.
Egypt refused.
Egyptians refused.
So, you know, so it's like Israel has been sort of put into this artificial situation that it's tried to get out of, hasn't been able to, and now it's kind of paying the price for the intransigence of the Arab nations, and you know that battle's been fought and lost. You know,
but there's a religious aspect, because I was always told that, and Hebron is considered among Palestinians, from what I understand, it's the most religious town in the West Bank. Yes. There are no movie theaters in Hebron, in the Arab section of Hebron, which it's a large city. I mean, I walked through it in the morning in different places. It's a big place, but at night when you walk through Hebron in the Palestinian section, there's not a woman on the street. It's men and boys. Not a woman on the street. It's a very traditionalist place, whereas most of the Palestinians in general, what I found out, are not very Muslim religious. We traveled with American Muslims, with African Americans mostly, and they wanted to have their prayers at different times of the day and in the refugee camp, and the Palestinians didn't do it. They said, "Oh, you can go over here." I think the issue, it's odd, the combination of the religious side and the not. No, on the Jewish side, Hebron is very important. That is religiously for Jews. Hebron and also Nablus are sites which they are important, and in Jewish history they are. I mean, they are. I mean, you know, there's a part in the Torah where Ishmael and Isaac go to bury their father, and it's in Hebron. It's a very short, like, little sentence, but it's there. I mean, it's, you know.
So why do people think that Hebron in 1929 is sort of regarded as the beginning of the modern day conflict? I mean, I had always thought that would be 1947, but there's cultural and historic ties that actually kick it back further, you know, back into, you know, the time before 1930. But those are pretty subtle, aren't they? I mean, what is it that ties October 3rd and October 7th and 1929 together?
Well, it's the massacre, and it's the religious call to the protection of Al-Aqsa, and that it's the determination of the Jews to take over not only all of the land, but all of the Muslim holy sites and prohibit Muslims from having access. And I think it was the language that the Mufti used in the call to the massacre in Hebron, which was identical to the calls from Hamas on October 7th. And I think that's part of I think that is the through line.
I think I want to add to that because if you listen to the words that are reported by the Grand Mufti that says the Jews are going to overtake, they're going to destroy our sacred buildings, they're going to demolish our heritage. You know, they are instilling the worst fears and threats based on religion. I think there's a role. I mean, I'm really struggling to say, is there a way for secular Jews and secular Arabs to begin to have a discussion, reclaim a position where they don't get coerced into the conflict to kill each other?
You know, it's funny because I've often thought that over here in the United States, the conversations between the Islamic community and the Jewish community, could go a long way to at least, I mean, certainly could at least show that conversation is possible because we're not directly trying to kill each other over here. And after the massacre in Pittsburgh, I remember the head of the Bucks County Islamic community. It was really quite moving when he spoke at the memorial service, about the relationship between, Jews and Muslims. I wonder, that seems to get lost over there. There doesn't seem to be that kind of
I don't know, maybe.
question. But Neil, I saw Neil, you had wanted to say something.
I can't help but think about, this, you say it started in 29 in Hebron, but what about all the pogroms in the Pale, all the massacres of Jews in Europe in the medieval times? This is not, different. It's kind of been going on a long time. It just so happens now it's happening there, but Jews have been attacked and killed in horrific ways over the centuries, where they've lived as a minority.
Also pogroms in the Arab world. It's forgotten.
Yes.
In Iraq.
Yes.
In
Iraq, in Morocco, France and Spain, and it's not unusual. And maybe I don't know if we want to go there, but it's unfortunate. It's another symptom of something.
It is and it isn't. I mean, obviously, we in the United States are from Eastern Europe, so that's like our heritage. And I'm not saying there's not a connection between killing Jews in one place or another, but think of the Jews who were living in Hebron. They were not European. They had not experienced those centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. They were supposedly living next to friends and family. So in that respect, it's different, the history. Obviously,
but that was happening to the Jews living in, France, right?
Right, but so obviously it's us as Jews, we see the through line, but it's kind of interesting. What this book is interesting in saying is it didn't start in 47. It didn't start in 48. That there was a history before then. And I think that's one of the really powerful things the book kind of goes to, that it's attempting to change this narrative of, it all started in 47 or 48, which is interesting because the reason the UN and England wanted to create the state of Israel is because nobody knew what to do with the Jews. They didn't want them coming into their countries. They didn't want them during the Holocaust, and they didn't want them after the war. So Israel was a very convenient solution, so to speak, for the international community because nobody wanted to take these survivors in. And somewhere I read, I don't know, it wasn't in the book, but it's sort of like you created the state of Israel. The Holocaust created the state of Israel, you know. The other thing I want to say to you, Neil, is that what I think a lot of people don't know, Jews as well, is the difference between religious Zionism and political Zionism. Political Zionism didn't really start till the end of the 19th century with Theodor Herzl. And it was in a movement of many countries wanting to nationalize and create their own place. So that's really important too. Anyway, there's just kind of some history. I don't disagree with you, Neil. I'm just sort of like, it's interesting to look at it in different angles.
But also people forget Jews they're indigenous to Israel.
Yes.
And this is the biggest point that is forgotten by all these students and these young. This is the biggest point they forget. And they're taught this whole stuff about colonial and Western and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's
Bullshit.
nonsense.
Yeah.
I just forgot what I was going to ask.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So you started off the discussion, Abraham, with something very interesting about, you know, haters and people who are deeply entrenched. And I come from a psychology background, so this is one of the things, you know, it's this whole thing of neurons. You have neural circuits that constantly go in the same way, and they become solid. And we do this in our own lives. We have little internal messages to ourselves that we can't seem to break out of, and part of that is neurological.
If you want, I will send you the title of that book. I think it is a very, very important book about research that has been done in a very tricky kind of way to map people who have to deal with changes, and if they don't understand the system, they get very angry and aggressive. And so it's concurrent testing and interviews and brain scans to locate where things are happening. And it turns out that people who are, liberal versus conservative have different locations where things are happening. And it's really significant work.
And I mean, and I think it's important because what I struggle with is I know all these things as a Jew, and I believe these things. And, you know, you go back to being depressed after reading this book because it reinforces some of the things I already knew. And so I stay within that, see, they're all out to kill us, and that's all there is to it. You know, it's like, how do we take in new information and break out of our own neural pathways?
It is so embedded. That's the problem. And how do you break out so that you can be still open to others? I'll just give you an interesting, for instance, my own father. I was raised in a very strict Orthodox home, and I hadn't seen my father in years. I had done all the violations, and finally, when I saw my father at one point, he said, "I could have been so proud of you if only you were religious."
Well, thinking about, we tend to talk about, the Palestinians and what they do, and I'm not talking necessarily about Hamas. That's a different conversation. But when we talk about the Palestinian on the street, as it were, we seem to talk about them one way, but then we don't really pay a lot of attention to some of the things that the settlers are doing, which are basically the same. And I understand why we do that. I think it's a very human thing, but it's also a part of the problem, and we need to ask ourselves, just as they need to ask themselves, okay, how do we overcome that? How do we develop the empathy, and the moral ground to sort of say, wait, no, if you're throwing rocks at somebody, that's a bad thing. It doesn't matter who you are. Or why you're doing it. It's a bad thing. That's been, it seems to me, lost. I'm wondering what people think about that. Is that a naive feeling for me to have?
It's been going on for decades in Israel that the government has ignored the violations by the settlers because it's been expedient. And now they have created a monster that they can't control. And so a population that was once in the West Bank very small is now, what, millions of people? There's no way of resettling them back into Israel. So, and the army and the police watch settlers, adults, teenagers, violate Palestinian homes, throw rocks, assault people, and stand there and do nothing. So there's no reason for the average Palestinian on the street to believe that they will ever be treated fairly by the Israeli government. So you can't, yeah, you can only create a partnership with people who trust you, right? And Israel's growing nationalist movement, and especially the settlers, have given no reason for moderate Palestinians to believe that they'll ever have a voice.
Well, it's a little more ambiguous that I observed than that, the things that I observed. We met with I don't know if you're aware of the settlement. This settlement is Tekoa. You ever heard of it? They even had a little article in the New York Times about that about 2 years ago. Tekoa is sort of like the hippie settlers. Anyway, their head at one point was this man, Menachem Froman. He was a rabbi. He was actually a paratrooper originally. And he was this interesting character. We met with him. We actually brought him to America and to meet with Obama. This is a whole story. And he gave a program at Temple University. But he was actually a friend of Arafat. Arafat used to call him my favorite Jew, even during the Intifada. He was a kind of a crazy, wacky guy. But the point I'm going to make about him is, indeed, there are undercurrents and there are odd elements. You're right about the settlers on the whole. The settlers we met in Hebron, they were like thugs. They looked like mafia guys or something. They were like very hardened. The irony is the spokesman for the settlers in Hebron, David Wilder, was talking to us, and you want to hear a great irony? And Sandy was there, and she found out that Sandy's mother taught that guy, David Wilder, who came from New Jersey, taught him Hebrew. Isn't that crazy? And so those guys, kind of a lost cause. The weird thing about them, they are fervently believe that that land is theirs. You got to understand, these guys, for religious reasons, in fact, this Froman guy was very wacky, I know, but he said, I don't care if the Palestinians are the government in the land where I am, as long as we can have the settlement of Jews here. He didn't care who was running the country. Now that's a minority, I'm sure, of all the settlers, but there are some ambiguities here. And I give you a little positive. We're talking such sad things. When we were in the north of Israel, this was Israel proper, not the West Bank. We went to a Muslim university run by a woman. It was a university with big modern buildings, some modern buildings, blah, blah, blah. It was astonishing. It was a kind of open kind of situation, which could not even have occurred on the West Bank. They couldn't have that university in the West Bank. So there are a lot, with all the craziness and everything and difficulties, there are Muslims. If you ask a lot of Arab, or you could call them Palestinian Israelis or Arab Israelis, they want to live in Israel. It's the crazy thing about this whole situation is how absolutely complex it is. It is unbelievably complex. And you're right. The trouble is we have the thugs, the muscle guys, and on the right in Israel sort of took over the situation because people got scared. And I don't think they're going to, but this is just what I feel. I think when this war is over, I think the future of Israel is going to be the hands of the people who served in the army in Gaza, the Israelis. And I think that they are not going to want, I have a little confidence in them finding a way out.
Well, we had a speaker at the show who was talking about the conflict, and he said it's misperceived. It's not right versus wrong, it's right versus right. And that's what makes it so complicated. And I hear what people think about that. I mean, is this sort of more nuanced and sort of more an in the weeds issue than we want to realize?
Lisa, did you want to say?
Mhm. Hi, sorry, a bit late to the proceedings. I think Israel has a huge problem having a coalition government. I know that things aren't going to change overnight, but inevitably, particularly in a small place, coalition government ends up with the tiny minority wagging the dog. And this is what we're having here. I mean, Netanyahu wasn't even directly elected by the majority of Israelis, but because of coalition government, we end up with Netanyahu again, and the extreme right wing is dictating to the rest of the country, and I'm sure a lot of Israelis feel this way, what they can and cannot do. And I think that it's a serious problem in Israel because they need the votes to form a government in this coalition system. They will always be subject to extreme minorities calling the shots. And I think that's a big, big problem. I mean, obviously, they're not going to change their government overnight, but that's the source of the major source of one of the problems in Israel, why it can't change tack. And it's the extremists running the show. And I think as far as the rest of the world is concerned, that's all they see. And they obviously news media will emphasize that because it's more newsworthy, they're more extreme. But what the world sees is that you've got two sets of extremists against each other. And Israel, the Israel that we know, is not like that at all. And people have in the outer world have no understanding of that. They think, oh, it's them at it again. So I think something PR or whatever has to be done.
And just as an aside, the book points out that Netanyahu is the one who basically brought all these right-wing groups into the mainstream.
Correct.
You know.
And Schwartz also points out, I was glad to see, even though, it's been known for a long time that Netanyahu was facilitating the strength of Hamas by allowing all this money to come in from, I guess, Qatar or someplace, because then that would keep the Arabs divided amongst themselves. And that duplicity on his part, helped them build all these trenches and arm themselves and get ready for October 7th. So Lynn asked the question at the beginning or sometime earlier, what is something we learned from this, something new? And, I don't know exactly what new I learned, but my new sort of experience, echoing what Kathy said a long time ago, is this utter hopelessness after reading this book of how in the hell is anything, I had some naive sense of, a two-state solution not all that long ago. And yeah. I don't see any chance for that. So I don't know. It's quite a brutal reading in so many ways.
Beyond that, it's I think what Israel is facing now feels to me almost irreconcilable, because you've got all of the social divisions, you have all of the political divisions, the rise of the nationalists, and increasing violence from Hezbollah, Hamas, all of that. So Israel is breaking apart both from within and without. And I I don't see how that's recoverable. I think it's one thing when you're fighting the enemy without and you're united within, but Israeli society now is very, very fractured.
As are we. I mean, you know, there's the parallels between Israel and the United States in terms of domestic politics are pretty, you know, are pretty striking. It's on the one hand, it's more complicated here because there's so many of us, but it's more complicated in Israel because there's such an imminent threat and there's already so much violence. And, you know, is that resolvable? I mean, it's you can't easily talk about breaking Israel apart into two different nations or anything like that. So, and I mean, within the Jewish community, I mean, just we talk about breaking up the United States. It's a totally different conversation with different stakes if you have it for Israel. But do people have thoughts about how, you know, we can start to bridge those gaps, or, you know, what kind of conversations we should be having?
I'm hopeful that there has to be some way for the secular and, you know, the everyday populations of you know, of both communities to isolate those people who claim they have a message from God, who have this idealism, and they are forcing the situation. They need to be separated and blocked from controlling the issue that affects everybody else.
I don't see that that's going to happen. I really don't, because on the one hand, like, I read book after book after book. I was very pleased to have read this one, as if reading one more book and understanding more deeply is somehow going to change anything. But when there's an education system within the Arab community that continues to teach hate day after day after day to every child growing up, teaching what we consider to be an alternative view of history, where are the people you're going to be able to talk to? Like, it's for decades, where is your partner in peace? Who wants to sit at the table and actually talk about peace?
But, you know, the question that I wanted to ask Abraham is how? You know, I agree with what Abraham that you were saying needs to happen, but how does that happen? How do people like us influence that, and even what should we be trying to influence? And you're on mute.
Well,
I don't hear a collective voice amongst that's strong enough from the liberal Israelis and liberals, American Jews, that speak up.
Well, I was going to make a point about, in general, if you're going to relate it to this country too, I'm a firm believer we have to get out of our little bubble. We have neighbors. We have to have neighbors in conversation. We don't have to have conversations that are political with people who have different political points of view, but we can be able to be civil and have social contact with people and not have to always be about political point of view. And conversely, in Israel, there are Arabs in Israel and Jews who interact daily, all the time. And in that is the start of the whole thing. Not in research, not in intellectual, but in human one-to-one. Give you a perfect example. Every month they play bluegrass with a bunch of musicians up the street in a jam with a bunch of people, the majority of which are Trump supporters, evangelical Christians. We get along, we put that on the back burner, and we get along fine. And we do things together. And I think doing things together and getting out of your bubble is the only way. We have more in common with each other. People have more in common with each other. We aren't locked into these things. And then we can respect, you know, you can disagree with a person's point of view. If they're very religious, let's say they have the big opinion is about abortion. Okay, I disagree with them. But I understand that they have their point of view, which to them is extremely important, and I have to respect that.
one of the speakers that we had, Mark referred to him in the year following October 7th. He's Israeli. He works for Friends of a Peace, American Peace Now, if you remember that. And we posed this question to him at the end of his talk, like, you know, what hope is there? And he's like, well, and he wasn't hopeful. You know, he said there's not going to be a bi-state solution. And he was very honest. It was one of the best, I think, speakers we had that year. But he said, he gave us some number, 150, 160 peace organizations in Israel, even after October 7th. And so, you know, to your point, Abraham, I think they are there, but we don't always know that. We don't see it in the New York Times. Yeah, maybe if you read Haaretz, you know, we don't know what's happening on the ground. And I think there is a lot of that happening on the ground, even after October 7th, but we don't see it as Americans sitting here. We don't get that information. And that was the most powerful thing he said, I think, you know, for me, after that talk. That's still going on. There's still people on both sides who are working towards peace.
You know,
I think what we don't realize here too, that Americans don't understand how segregated Israeli society is. Unless you go out of your way to have relationships with Arabs, you don't come into contact with Arabs. Very few places are integrated. The schools are not integrated. The daycare's not integrated. The sports leagues are not integrated. So unless you go out of your way to create a curated experience for your children where they'll have an opportunity to meet other Arab kids, it just doesn't happen. So we have a more homogenous society. People get to know each other. They're not, well, maybe we do and maybe we don't, but we strive for it. We fought for it and we strive for it. And there's a lot less of that in Israel. And a lot of Arab kids don't speak Hebrew at all. A lot of people going into, you know, from the villages who go into the army have to learn Hebrew before they can actually serve. There's just so much more segregation than we on the whole tolerate here or believe is right for them. But there are very few opportunities for engagement unless you go out of your way to find it. And I think fewer people do that. They just buy into whatever narrative there is about what it is that Arabs or Palestinians think, and everybody keeps their distance. So you don't really learn much about what goes on somebody else's dinner table.
a lot of it's, you know, I found myself conducting a little thought experiment a while ago because I read Haaretz every day and I read the New York Times every day. And it's interesting how sometimes you can see they'll cover the same story in pretty much the same way. But the New York Times will be called anti-Semitic in their viewpoint. Haaretz is saying the same thing, and I don't think there's many people credibly calling Haaretz, you know, anti-Semitic. But there is this perception, I think, based on where the voice comes from. You can, whoever's saying it, sort of driving the message as opposed to the message itself. And you know, I think that's a big part of the issue here, and I think we've all been saying that. We've got ingrained history, we've got ingrained culture, sort of working against us in some ways. I mean, is it hopeless?
That's a close-ended question.
Well, it's a question.
Well, yeah.
I'd like to say, yeah, that was my question number 5.
I mean,
but it's not. But no, but it's a legitimate, I think, question. This is a conflict that's been going on for centuries. It's now being defined in the context of Israel-Palestine. But still, how do we as individuals change things? Scott.
Well, I would just say, going back to, I believe, what people have said before, which goes back to just basic humanity and dealing with people and interacting with people on a one-to-one basis and learning about who they are as an individual and building. I mean, it will take a very, very long time to change people's hearts and minds. But when you know people personally and you have that personal experience and you know them in a very different way than the way they're portrayed in the press or publicly, I think it's very gradual, but it's the only way to change people's hearts and minds. That's the only hope that at least I have.
I wanted to mention that when we were still doing the lunches at the shul, Louise and some others were part of a group of Jewish and Islamic women. That there were some Islamic women who brought Islamic food to the church. And I remember, we would taste that. There was an interesting experience. And I mean, I don't know what's happened to that organization now and whether they hold together or have conversations, but the food aspect is a strong one.
Mhm.
There's Louise.
Yeah, I can speak to that. Our group couldn't go beyond when things started happening. We had some sympathy from the Muslim women, but our group is not meeting now. We're trying to get it together again because under Trump, there's even more that we have in common. But it's very, very difficult. It's very touchy. They've been tremendously supportive. Like after Pittsburgh, we all came together. But this one's, it's getting harder and harder is all I can say.
You say that and it's sort of, I'm saying, well, how do we?
What?
I was just thanking Louise for that work. It's a remarkable kind of thing that you've been involved in.
Yeah, I miss it.
Well, I was just sitting here thinking, well, how can we resurrect things like that? I think the dialogue between Jews and Muslims, especially in the United States right now, is very important for a whole lot of reasons. But is it the kind of dialogue that people on either side really, are willing to have right now?
I think first you have to establish trust within a group because it is so sensitive that unless there is a trusting relationship, you're not going to get anywhere. So it takes time and exposure and, cooking together and doing little things if you really want to establish a relationship where you can go to sensitive topics.
How about some of the people that we haven't really heard from or haven't really said anything? What do you think? So I'll let you self-select to see if we can get you to chime in. I'm looking at a couple of specific people right now. You should all be warned. Sally. Rita. Rita, you said, I'm sorry. No, seriously, I'd just like to throw it open and see what other people are thinking. Or not.
Pretty depressed because you started, Mark. So, I didn't read the book, as I said, because I'm depressed enough about this country and the same kinds of issues, tensions, and mistrusts. And it just doesn't seem doable.
I have to say, when I finished the book, I didn't feel it was hopeless.
Say more.
Well, say more, but maybe it was just the fact that, she had this perspective of telling both sides, and of along the way telling stories of her interactions with Arabs and Palestinians, which were positive, painful in some cases, but still positive. Sally, did you want to say something?
I would just like to say that I agree with just about everything Kathy said, but she had better words than I do. So thank you. I think it's very hard. I don't think one book can change the world. And unfortunately, I think we're living in a world where people are not looking to books. Okay, we're preaching to the choir here. And I think that we have a whole generation that probably doesn't even know who Leon Uris is. So therefore, how are we going to get beyond that into something like this? I think that's very difficult.
We've only got a few minutes left, so I want to see if anybody has any way they'd like to sum up, the discussion in the book or anything like that.
I think I see hope in Israeli society coming from organizations like Brothers and Sisters in Arms. I think they have a powerful voice because the army in Israel is such a unifying, cohesive factor. And I think for people from the army at all ranks, from all branches, to come together and say either what they were, the things they saw and did, obviously this is before October 7th, but the things they saw and did in Gaza and the West Bank are not right and are not reflective of what they believe Israeli society should be. I see that that's a very hopeful trend, and I hope that they can continue leading change from within.
I want to mention that I'm hoping to get a speaker who's actually doing a program this weekend at the Jewish Princeton Center, somebody that I know personally who's one of the founders of Arava. I don't know if anybody knows that organization in the Negev. And what they have is a environmental studies group where they have Israelis, Jordanians, Palestinians, Egyptians, all working on science projects, working together so they can go back to their home villages and improve life, because the premise is that environment has no borders. And I think it's a remarkable kind of coexistence, getting down to basic facts that, that we live in one world. We have to, each learn the technologies and cooperation to make it better. And I think, and I hope that I can get him to do a program for us.
I think that's a great idea, Abraham. My daughter spent 6 years at the Araba.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yes, and they are, and I do follow them, and I have gone to some of their seminars online, and I do think that that's one of our only hopes, that groups will continue to work together, even on the smallest level, and that we will continue to use our voices.
Have any of you read the book? It's called The Fox Hunt by Mohammed Al-Samawi. I highly, highly recommend it. One of my friends gave it to everybody at their Seder one year, and she wrote about it, and I read it, and everybody I've given it to loves it. It's about a Yemeni peace activist and how he came to become a peace activist. So I know, just talking about hopelessness and hopefulness and education, I think it might, it's several years old now, but I think it might, just give us all kind of some background on, what it's like to be taught to hate Jews and then how to unlearn that. And I just think it's an amazing book. And, spoiler, he now lives in the United States, and he runs something called Abrahamic House in Washington, D.C. And he has people from, 3 different religious backgrounds, and they all live together and do programming in D.C. for a year or 2 years, and they do stuff in the community. And he's just a very kind man, and I think that he's You know, he's the kind of person I hope I could be someday. But anyway, The Fox Hunt by Muhammad Al-Samawi is something I would recommend to everybody.
I'm going
Mark,
to,
we thank you for bringing this to us. This is important. Better to know than to not know.
And
I was gonna-
one second. And I want to thank Abraham and Jerry, because if you hadn't organized the trip to the Jewish Museum, I heard Yardena speak and I bought the book and I gave it to him. So thank you.
And I just want to say, if you haven't read the whole book, you should. And I found there's a lot of little bits of hope scattered through it, and they all involve the interaction between Jews and Arabs. Sometimes it's the author and her recounting her experience interviewing somebody on the West Bank or a Palestinian official. Sometimes it's just stories she tells, often of the Arab families who saved Jews during the massacre in Hebron in 1929. The overall story is very painful, especially right now, but there are these glimmers in there, which makes me think, if I had to sum it up, I would say, you know, when I read what some of these Arabs say, I think, you know, they're not all committed to this line of hatred. You know, that it doesn't feel like a natural state for many, many people. And it means there's work to do to sort of break them out of where they might be. But that's still sort of a hopeful thing to me. So I'm going to make that my last thing, unless there's anybody else, or anybody else can go after me. And thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thank you. Thank you very much.
doing this.
Thank
Come
you.
on.
Really
Thanks.
good discussion.
Bye-bye.
Yep.